Thank you very much. I'm William Pegues from the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which is the development finance institution of the U.S. government. And I'm here to talk to you today about some financing consideration, particularly in large water projects that we see around the world. OPIC has a mission to mobilize private U.S. capital in emerging markets. We do this in a variety of ways across sectors. Everything from healthcare and education and SME finance all the way through to very large energy and other sorts of infrastructure projects. We have in India presently a portfolio of approximately $1.6 billion, and that is spread liberally across sectors from microfinance and SMEs to solar and wind projects that we financed, particularly in the past 5 years under the Prime Minister's National Solar Initiative. We deploy capital through three main ways: through loan finance, loans and loan guarantees, through political risk insurance, in which we can insure projects located in countries with high political risk against things like currency inconvertibility, government expropriation of assets, and political violence. And we also make loans, short tenor bullet maturity loans that look very much like equity investments and exits to private equity funds, investing in, particularly in SME sectors in these markets via a competitive bidding process. We currently work in almost 100 countries around the world, and we have a portfolio of approximately $23 billion. The next slide shows just some representative water projects that we have financed over the past 10 years or so. We announced this week in India a $12.5 million loan to Water Health India, which is a company that is setting up approximately 900 purification facilities and plants around the country. These are basically vending machines where consumers can purchase potable drinking water for up to 3 to 4 times cheaper than they can get bottled water. These are located in railway stations, bus stations, shopping areas, any place with a high degree of foot traffic to give people better access to drinking water in India. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see a couple large-scale infrastructure projects that we've done. The DC Water project in Jordan, we financed a decade ago. It became operational in 2014. And this was a 325-kilometer pipeline bringing water from an aquifer in southern Jordan up to the capital city of Amman. And also we financed the desalination plant in Algeria in 2005, which became operational in 2008. And that provides 200,000 cubic meters of drinking water per day to Algiers. Most large water infrastructure projects are done through the public-private partnership structure that has been set up and has worked fairly well over the past 20 to 30 years. In this model, which works for goods that are produced for public purposes, such as roads, water, power plants, and such, the public sector entity actually owns the asset. The private sector entity contracts to design, build, finance, and generally operate and maintain the asset over a defined period of time on behalf of the government entity in return for a tariff or concession agreement. The assets commonly managed under this structure tend to be motorways, toll roads, ports, airports, power plants, irrigation systems, and water supply infrastructure. And a key component of what I'll talk about on the next few slides is in financing these projects, allocating the risk between the lenders who are providing debt to the project, such as OPIC, the private investors who are designing and building and operating the asset and providing their own equity risk capital, and the public sector entity that wants the asset to be operated on behalf of the public to provide a public good. And allocation of risk among these parties is a crucial part of negotiating these agreements. So I'll talk on the next 3 slides about several elements of bankable concession agreements for these sorts of projects. The first requirement is that the debt has generally a long tenor, 10, 15, maybe 20 years, that gives the asset sufficient time to repay the debt and give the equity a proper return, and also provides a sufficient period whereas if there are problems in the operation of the asset, those can be rectified and the project won't be put into distress because of pressure from the cash flow to service debt prematurely. The second component is a well-structured tariff for the payment of the service provided. This generally takes two forms, a take and pay or a take or pay agreement. In a take or pay agreement, the government entity pays for the product regardless of whether it has the ability or the desire to take it. In a take and pay agreement, the government entity essentially has the right to refuse delivery, and if it does so, it doesn't have to pay. And the tariff structure needs to be such that it covers repayment of the operating costs, the debt service, and also provides the equity capital, which is at risk in the project, an appropriate return. It's also important that the tariff is indexed for inflation and foreign exchange risk over time so that that doesn't impair the performance of the project. The next requirement is a creditworthy counterparty. So generally, there's a government entity, a ministry, or operating entity that is purchasing the product. In the case of water, it might be the water ministry. It's very important that this entity has a reliable history of paying for a product. If it doesn't, generally, the lenders and the equity will require some sort of credit support so that in case the government is unable to pay for the asset, a liquidity instrument such as a letter of credit from a creditworthy bank can be drawn upon, allowing the asset to continue to operate, to pay for its operating expenses, and to service the debt in the meantime. The gold standard of credit support in these cases is generally a sovereign guarantee from the national government so that if there is a condition under which the ministry or entity responsible for paying for the commodity can't do so, the national government will step in and satisfy that payment obligation. The next provision we look for in these project agreements to make them commercially acceptable is a provision that allows for change in law or change in tax over time. So as I said, these assets are generally financed over maybe a 15 or 20-year period. The repayment of the debt and the cash flow that enables the asset to pay its operating expenses then is contingent on a projection made at the beginning of the project over a very long period. If regulations and taxes change in the interim such that it impairs the cash flow of the project, then generally the tariff needs to be indexed such that it would increase if taxes increase. Again, so that the asset can continue to operate, the project continues to produce the product for the public, and the debt and equity can get their capital returned. The next element that we look for are how we define elements of force majeure. So these are what are commonly called acts of God, events that take place that are outside the control of the project company. Again, it's very important to have provisions that allow the project company to be excused from performing its obligations if something outside of its control happens. In a country such as India, this is usually not a consideration because it's a very stable country. Many of the countries we operate in do have a substantial amount of political risk, and if there's public insurrection, civil war, something like that, that's a mitigating circumstance that would allow the project company to get out of its performance obligations. And the next provision is for dispute resolution. And here it's just important in case of conflicts among the public sector entity, the operator, and the lender, that there's some offshore arbitration at arm's length among the parties so that there's a disinterested arbiter operating in a neutral location under internationally accepted rules. And the final two elements I'll talk about have to do with termination and assignment of the project agreements. In the case of termination, it's important that the agreements have some sort of termination payment or provision for the debt to be repaid in case the government decides to terminate the project agreement for some reason. If the government happens to default on its obligation, these agreements generally contemplate that they're not only expected to repay the debt in full, but also give the equity its return. Obviously, if the project company fails to fulfill its obligations, it has no right to get a return on its investment. And the final provision has to do with what we call assignments of project agreements to the lenders. These projects operate over long periods of time. It's very important if the project company that's operating the asset on behalf of the government runs into trouble, it can't fulfill its obligations, that the lenders are able to be assigned all of the project agreements so that they can step in to the role of the operator, continue to operate the asset, continue to produce the product for the public while the project is restructured and a third party can be brought in to operate it. That concludes my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention.